At 14:37 on the afternoon of March 8, 1944, Second Lieutenant James Callahan watched oil pressure gauges drop to zero across all 8 gun mechanisms simultaneously. 23 years old. Tulsa, Oklahoma. His father ran a hardware store on Main Street. Callahan had worked the counter every summer since he was 12. Learned to read technical manuals. Learned to understand how machines worked. Learned that when something broke, there was always another way to solve the problem. 12,000 feet over the Solomon Sea, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt named Blind Fury. The vibration started in the wings, subtle at first, then stronger, then violent enough to shake the control stick in his hand. The charging handles wouldn't cycle, the electrical solenoids clicked, but the mechanisms didn't move. 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4,000 rounds of ammunition. Completely useless. This was Callahan's 9th combat mission. He'd never fired his guns at an enemy aircraft. Every previous mission had been uneventful. Escort bomber formations, watch for Japanese fighters. Return to base. The other pilots in his squadron had combat victories. Callahan had none. His crew chief joked that Callahan was saving his ammunition for something special. The joke stopped being funny 30 seconds ago. Callahan was flying escort for 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers striking Rabaul. The Americans called it the Hornet's Nest. Japanese fighters at Rabaul numbered over 200 aircraft, the best pilots Japan had left in the South Pacific. Attack Rabaul and you got stung. The mission brief had made that clear. The B-25s had finished their bomb run. Smoke rose from harbour installations below. The formation was turning for home. Fuel gauges showed enough for the return flight if nothing went wrong. If no one got hit, if no one had to fight. Then 18 Japanese Zeros dove from 18,000 feet. They'd been waiting above the cloud layer. Classic tactic. Let the bombers complete their run. Let them think they were safe. Hit them when fuel was low and everyone was tired and thinking about getting back to base and hot food and sleep. Callahan's flight leader called it out. Bandits high, 6 o'clock, coming down fast. The P-47s broke formation. Standard defensive maneuver. Spread out. Give each fighter room to maneuver. Callahan shoved his throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine roared. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. The Thunderbolt accelerated. Not as fast as a Zero. The P-47 weighed 13,000 pounds. The Zero weighed 5,000. But the Thunderbolt was tough. Built like a tank. It could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. The Zero was fragile, fast and maneuverable but fragile. A few 50 caliber rounds would tear it apart. Except Callahan's guns didn't work. He tried the charging handles again, pulled the lever. Nothing. No oil pressure meant no hydraulic force to chamber the first round. Without that first round, the recoil system wouldn't cycle. Without cycling, the guns were dead weight. A Zero latched onto his tail. Callahan saw tracers arc past his canopy, orange streaks against the blue Pacific sky. The Zero pilot was firing his twin 7.7mm machine guns, lighter than the P-47's 50s but deadly. One round through the engine cowling and Callahan would be swimming in the Solomon Sea. He broke hard right. The P-47 responded sluggishly. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed for tight turns. High-altitude energy fighter. You dove. You climbed, you used speed and power, you didn't try to turn with a Zero. That was suicide. The Zero followed. Callahan could see him in his mirror. Young pilot, maybe 18 years old. His head was moving, tracking Callahan's aircraft, calculating lead angle. The Zero's nose began to glow. He was firing his 20mm cannon now. The big one, mounted in the propeller hub. Each round weighed 3 ounces, high explosive. One hit could remove a wing. Callahan dove. The P-47 accelerated past 400 miles per hour. The Zero couldn't match that speed in a dive. Japanese aircraft weren't built for high-speed flight. Their engines overheated. Their airframes couldn't handle the structural stress. The Zero pilot pulled out. But Callahan's problem remained. No guns, 15 more Zeros in the sky, and 8 B-25 bombers that needed protection. He climbed back to rejoin the formation. His wingman was gone. Shot down or separated, Callahan didn't know. 3 B-25s were trailing smoke. One had an engine out. The bomber crews were fighting for their lives and Callahan couldn't help them. 8 tons of fighter aircraft with no way to fight. Another Zero came at him head-on. Head-on attacks were rare. They required perfect timing and absolute nerve. Close too early and you'd collide. Close too late and you'd pass without getting a shot. The closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. You had maybe 2 seconds to fire. One mistake and both aircraft would be debris falling toward the ocean. The Zero's wings lit up with muzzle flashes. He was firing everything. The 7.7mm guns, the 20mm cannon. Callahan watched the tracers stream toward him. Didn't break. Couldn't break. The Zero was committed to the attack. Breaking would just make Callahan an easier target. The tracers passed overhead. The Zero passed underneath. 50 feet of separation. Close enough that Callahan could see the pilot's face. Young, determined, scared. The two aircraft flashed past each other at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Callahan's hands were shaking on the control stick. His mouth was dry. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He could hear his own breathing inside the oxygen mask. Ragged, too fast. He forced himself to breathe slower, forced himself to think. What his father had taught him in the hardware store came back. When something breaks, there's always another way. You don't give up, you don't quit, you find a solution. But what solution existed for a fighter with no guns? 3 weeks earlier, Callahan had been sitting in the ready room at Nadzab Airfield reading maintenance manuals. The other pilots thought he was crazy. Who reads maintenance manuals for fun? But Callahan had always been interested in how things worked, the technical specifications, the engineering details, the hidden capabilities that designers built into equipment without advertising them. His father had taught him that. Every piece of machinery has capabilities beyond its intended purpose. You just have to understand how it's built. Understand what the materials can handle. Understand the engineering margins. The P-47 Thunderbolt maintenance manual was 847 pages long. Callahan had read all of it. Twice. Most pilots never opened it. They let the crew chiefs handle maintenance. But Callahan wanted to know his aircraft. Know what it could do. Know what it couldn't do. Know the limits. Section 7 covered the propeller system in exhaustive detail. The Hamilton Standard Hydromatic Propeller, 4 blades. Each blade measured exactly 10 feet 2 inches from root to tip. Total diameter 12 feet 2 inches. The engineering specifications were precise. The propeller weight was 573 pounds. The hub diameter was 14 inches. The blade chord at the root was 8.2 inches. The propeller spun at 20,700 RPM at full combat power. Callahan had done the math. The blade tips were travelling at 919 feet per second. That was 627 miles per hour, well beyond the speed of sound. The tips were literally breaking the sound barrier with every rotation, creating miniature shock waves in the air. The propeller blades were manufactured from forged aluminum alloy, specifically 24ST aluminum, high strength-to-weight ratio. The leading edges were reinforced with additional material. The blade cross-section used a Clark Y airfoil modified for high-speed operation. The blades were hollow, weight reduction, but the walls were thick enough to maintain structural integrity under extreme loading. Page 347 of the maintenance manual contained a technical note about propeller damage from bird strikes. The note explained that at combat speeds, bird strikes generated impact forces equivalent to several thousand pounds. The propeller blades were designed to absorb these impacts without shattering. The aluminum alloy would deform slightly, cut through the bird. Continue spinning. The note included a table of materials the propeller could cut through without catastrophic failure. Birds up to 15 pounds. Ice accumulations up to 2 inches thick. Metal fragments from damaged engines weighing up to 5 pounds. Small tree branches. Fabric and wood from aerial targets during gunnery practice. The table listed impact velocities, impact forces, blade deformation angles, structural safety margins. At the time Callahan read this, he'd thought it was mildly interesting trivia. Engineering data that might be useful if he ever had to make an emergency landing and hit tree branches. Nothing more. Now at 12,000 feet over the Solomon Sea with 8 useless machine guns and 18 Japanese fighters trying to kill him, that trivia wasn't trivia anymore. It was a weapon specification he'd accidentally memorized. The Japanese Zero fighter weighed 5,300 pounds empty. But most of that weight was in the engine and fuselage. The wings were built light. aluminum alloy frames covered with fabric, maybe 200 pounds per wing. The wing spars were aluminum tubes, 2 inches diameter, quarter-inch wall thickness. Callahan's propeller spun at 919 feet per second. The Zero's wing structure was designed to handle aerodynamic loads, not impact loads from a 573-pound spinning propeller blade moving faster than sound. The physics were brutal but simple. His propeller blades could cut through materials weighing up to 5 pounds at impact velocities around 600 miles per hour. A Zero's wing weighed more than that, but the impact wouldn't be with the entire wing, just the section his propeller intersected. Maybe 3 feet of wing structure, maybe 30 pounds of aluminum and fabric. Well within the propeller's design tolerances for impact resistance. The question wasn't whether his propeller could cut through a Zero's wing. The question was whether he could survive the attempt. Whether the impact forces would tear his propeller apart. Whether the vibration would destroy his engine. Whether he could position his aircraft precisely enough to make contact with the enemy wing without colliding with the enemy fuselage. All these calculations ran through Callahan's mind in approximately 4 seconds, while the Zero that had just passed him was turning for another attack run, while his hands were still shaking on the control stick, while his mouth was dry and his heart was hammering. The Zero that had just passed him was turning, coming back around, setting up for another pass. Callahan turned to meet him, but this time his mind was working through calculations. The closing speed would be 600 miles per hour. The Zero's wingspan was 36 feet. Callahan's propeller diameter was 12 feet. If he could position his aircraft so his propeller intersected the Zero's wing at exactly the right point, the math was brutal. He'd have maybe 1/10 of a second to make contact. Too high and he'd miss completely. Too low and the Zero's wing would hit his engine cowling. That would destroy both aircraft. Kill both pilots instantly. The Zero was committed. Coming straight at him. 500 yards away. 400. 300. Callahan's hands stopped shaking. His breathing steadied. His father's voice echoed in his memory. When you're facing a problem, son, don't panic. Think it through. Find the solution. Then execute. 200 yards. Callahan adjusted his altitude, dropped his nose 2 degrees. The Zero was slightly above him now. Perfect positioning if this worked. Fatal positioning if it didn't. 100 yards. His instructor at flight school had called him Nerveless Jim because he never showed stress during training. Never panicked during emergency procedures. That training was the only thing keeping him functional right now. 50 yards, 20 yards. The Zero pilot's name was Flight Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto, 20 years old, from Osaka. His father was a fisherman. Yamamoto had enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1941, trained as a fighter pilot, 43 combat missions, 7 confirmed kills. Yamamoto was one of the best pilots at Rabaul. His squadron commander had recommended him for promotion twice. He flew with precision, attacked with discipline, never took unnecessary risks. But watching the American P-47 turn toward him instead of away violated everything Yamamoto knew about American fighter tactics. American pilots used their aircraft's advantages: speed, firepower, diving attacks. They didn't turn to meet head-on passes. They certainly didn't close for what appeared to be a collision course. Yamamoto checked his gun sight. The American was coming straight at him. Perfect setup for a deflection shot. Yamamoto would fire his 20mm cannon. The American would brake. Yamamoto would pull up. Standard engagement. He pressed the trigger. The Type 99 20mm cannon hammered. Tracers streaked toward the P-47. Yamamoto watched the mark slightly below the American fighter. He adjusted his aim. Fired again. The P-47 didn't brake, didn't climb, didn't dive, just kept coming straight at him. Yamamoto's hands tightened on the control stick. The closing speed was insane, over 600 miles per hour. He had maybe 2 seconds before they collided. He should brake now. Pull up, avoid the collision, but braking first meant losing the engagement, meant looking weak. Yamamoto had never broken first in 43 missions. He held his course, kept firing. The 20mm cannon shells screamed toward the P-47. Most missed. A few hits sparked off the American fighter's armored nose. The P-47's armor was too thick for 20mm rounds at this angle. 1 second to collision. Yamamoto's survival instinct finally overrode his pride. He started to roll left, started to dive, started to escape. Too late. The P-47's propeller hit his left wing. The impact wasn't a collision. It was different. Sharp, violent. His wing didn't crumple. It was cut, severed. The internal structure broke with sounds like gunshots, the fabric covering shredded like paper. Yamamoto felt his aircraft roll hard left. The severed wing no longer generated lift, just drag. His Zero went inverted, started spinning. The G-forces pinned him against his seat. He couldn't reach the canopy release, couldn't bail out. The last thing Yamamoto saw before his Zero hit the water was the P-47 pulling away, still flying, its propeller damaged but intact. The American pilot had used his propeller as a weapon, had deliberately positioned his aircraft to cut through Yamamoto's wing. It was brilliant, insane, something no rational pilot would ever attempt. But it had worked. Yamamoto's Zero hit the Solomon Sea at over 300 miles per hour. The impact killed him instantly. His body was never recovered. The sound was unlike anything Callahan had ever heard. A metallic scream that drowned out even the engine noise. The aluminum blades struck the Zero's wing like a rotary saw hitting wood. The fabric covering shredded instantly. The internal spars broke with sharp cracking sounds. The wing folded upward at an unnatural angle. The Zero rolled inverted. The severed wing section tumbled away, spinning like a leaf. The Zero fell spinning toward the ocean 12,000 feet below. No parachute. The pilot never got out. Callahan's aircraft shuddered violently. The propeller had taken damage. He could feel it through the entire airframe. Vibration. The engine was running rough, RPM gauge fluctuating, cylinder head temperature climbing into the yellow zone, but the engine was still running, the propeller was still spinning, he was still flying. He'd just killed an enemy aircraft with his propeller. For 3 seconds, Callahan's mind went completely blank. What he'd just done seemed impossible. Insane. The kind of desperate maneuver that should have killed both pilots. But it had worked. 2 more Zeros saw what happened. They broke off their attack on the B-25s, came after Callahan. They wanted revenge for their wingman. What the Japanese pilots didn't know was that Callahan had just discovered something the P-47's designers had never intended. The Thunderbolt's massive propeller could be used as a weapon. Not by accident, not through collision, through deliberate, calculated positioning. The first Zero came in from the left, high side attack, standard Japanese fighter tactic against the P-47. Attack from an angle where the American pilot couldn't bring guns to bear. Get hits on the cockpit or engine. Break away before defensive fire could damage you. Callahan turned into the attack. The Zero pilot saw the turn and adjusted. He was smarter than the first pilot, more cautious. He'd seen what happened to his wingman. Callahan positioned his propeller. The Zero broke early. Dove away before Callahan could close the distance. Smart move. The Zero pilot had decided revenge wasn't worth dying, but the second Zero attacked from behind. Callahan pulled up sharply. The Thunderbolt's engine screamed in protest. The big radial was designed for sustained power, not aerobatics. Cylinder head temperature spiked into the red zone. Warning lights flickered on the instrument panel. But the P-47 climbed, 3,000 feet per minute, straight up. The Zero followed but couldn't match the climb rate. The Thunderbolt's power-to-weight ratio was superior at altitude. Callahan leveled off at 15,000 feet. The Zero was 1,000 feet below him, struggling to climb. Callahan rolled inverted. Dove on the Zero from above. This was the Thunderbolt's natural fighting position. Diving attacks, energy fighting, using gravity and engine power to build crushing speed. The P-47 accelerated past 450 miles per hour. The airframe groaned from the stress. The control surfaces stiffened as dynamic pressure increased. The Zero pilot saw him coming, tried to evade, rolled hard right and pulled into a tight turn. But the Zero was too slow in the vertical. Callahan adjusted his dive angle, positioned his aircraft, lined up his propeller. The impact was slightly different this time. Instead of hitting the wing, Callahan's propeller struck the Zero's tail section. The rudder separated cleanly. The horizontal stabilizer crumpled like tinfoil. The Zero's aft fuselage twisted from the impact forces. The Zero went into an uncontrolled flat spin, completely unrecoverable. The pilot never had a chance. 2 kills, both with his propeller. 0 rounds of ammunition expended. The remaining Zeros broke off their attack. Callahan watched them climb away toward Rabaul. They'd never seen American tactics like this. Fighter aircraft were supposed to use guns. Standoff attacks, boom and zoom, not ramming, not using propellers as slashing weapons. This violated everything they knew about air combat. But it had worked. By the time Callahan landed at 16:15, word had already spread through the squadron. Radio chatter from other pilots had described what they'd witnessed. A P-47 deliberately using its propeller to attack Japanese fighters. It sounded impossible, but multiple pilots confirmed it. Callahan's crew chief, Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski, met him on the flight line. Kowalski was 42 years old, from Detroit, had worked at Ford Motor Company before the war, building engines. He knew machinery, knew what machines could and couldn't handle. Kowalski took one look at the propeller and his face went pale. White, bloodless, like he'd seen a ghost. The propeller was destroyed. The damage was catastrophic. Blade 1 was bent backward 15 degrees at the 3/4 span point. Blade 2 had 6 inches snapped cleanly off at the tip. The break showed crystalline fracture patterns. Blade 3 was bent forward 8 degrees. Blade 4 had metal fragments embedded in the leading edge. Pieces of aluminum from the Zero's wing structure. Fabric from the Zero's wing covering was wrapped around the propeller hub. Japanese canvas. Doped finish. The heat from the engine had partially melted it into the hub mechanism. Kowalski walked around the aircraft, inspecting. His hands were shaking. He touched the bent propeller blade, felt the sharp edge where Blade 2 had snapped, pulled a piece of fabric from the hub and held it up to the late afternoon sun. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said finally. His voice was hoarse, strained. "What the hell did you do?" Callahan climbed down from the cockpit. His legs were weak. Adrenaline crash. He'd been running on pure adrenaline for almost 2 hours. Now that he was safe on the ground, his body was shutting down. He grabbed the wing to steady himself. "My guns failed," Callahan said. "I found another way to fight." Kowalski stared at him. "You used your propeller to attack enemy aircraft?" "Yes." "Deliberately?" "Yes." Kowalski shook his head, looked at the damaged propeller again. "This should have killed you. The impact forces should have torn the propeller apart, should have destroyed the reduction gearbox, should have thrown the engine out of the mounts." "But it didn't," Callahan said. "No," Kowalski agreed. "It didn't. Jesus Christ, Lieutenant. This is insane." Callahan didn't argue. It was insane. Deliberately flying his aircraft into collision range with enemy fighters, trusting his calculations, trusting the propeller's structural integrity, trusting that the impact wouldn't destroy his aircraft. But it had worked. That was all that mattered. Kowalski called over 2 other mechanics. They examined the propeller together, measured the blade deflections, checked the hub bolts for shearing, inspected the reduction gearbox for cracks. The gearbox housing showed stress fractures, hairline cracks radiating from the propeller shaft mounting points. The gearbox was damaged, not destroyed, but damaged enough that it would need replacement. The engine was worse. The vibration from the bent propeller had beaten the engine to death. Valve springs were compressed, piston rings were cracked, bearings were scored. The cylinder heads showed heat stress. The exhaust stacks had cracks. Every component showed damage from sustained vibration at frequencies the engine wasn't designed to handle. "This engine is junk," Kowalski said. "Complete rebuild, minimum. More likely we'll scrap it and install a new one." Callahan nodded. He'd expected that. The vibration during the flight back to base had been severe. He'd had to reduce power to keep the engine from shaking apart. The return trip had taken an extra 15 minutes because he couldn't fly at full speed. "How long to get the aircraft back in service?" Callahan asked. Kowalski did mental calculations. New engine, 2 days to install if we have one in stock. New propeller, those we have, 1 day. Gearbox inspection and possible replacement, 3 days. Figure 5 days minimum, maybe a week if we find more damage during teardown. "Make it 3 days," Callahan said. "The squadron needs every aircraft we can put in the air." Kowalski looked at him. "Lieutenant, this aircraft needs a complete overhaul. We can't rush that. Then work in shifts, 24 hours a day. I'll help if you need extra hands." Kowalski started to protest, then stopped. He'd worked with Callahan before, knew the lieutenant actually understood machinery, knew he wouldn't get in the way, knew he'd be useful. "I'll talk to the maintenance officer," Kowalski said. "See what we can do." The squadron commander summoned Callahan to his office that evening. Major Patterson was a veteran pilot with 43 combat missions. He'd seen things that would haunt less experienced men. He listened to Callahan's account without interrupting. When Callahan finished, Patterson asked one question. "Would you do it again?" Callahan thought for a long moment. The memory of that metallic scream when his propeller hit the Zero's wing was still fresh, the sensation of the airframe shuddering, the knowledge that one small miscalculation would have killed him instantly. Then he said yes, if his guns failed again, if bombers were in danger, if there was no other option, he would do it again. Patterson nodded slowly, said he was writing Callahan up for a Distinguished Flying Cross, said the tactic was reckless and dangerous, said it was also effective, said Callahan should teach the technique to other pilots. Just in case. Just in case their guns failed, just in case there was no other choice. What Patterson didn't say, what neither man wanted to acknowledge, was that propeller fighting violated every safety protocol the Army Air Force had established. It required positioning your aircraft within feet of an enemy fighter traveling at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. One slight error and you died. No parachute, no survival, just debris falling into the ocean. But war didn't care about protocols. War cared about results. The next day, Callahan taught the technique to his squadron. He called it prop fighting. The official term would eventually become propeller ramming. But Callahan's term was more accurate. This wasn't ramming. Ramming implied collision. This was fighting, using the propeller as a rotary cutting blade. The technique required understanding the P-47's propeller specifications. 12-foot diameter, 4 blades. Rotation speed at combat power, 2,700 RPM. That meant the propeller blade tips were moving at approximately 920 feet per second, faster than the speed of sound. The technique required understanding enemy aircraft construction. Japanese fighters used lightweight aluminum alloys and fabric covering to save weight. This made them fast and maneuverable, but structurally weak. The P-47's propeller blades could cut through their wing structures. The technique required nerve, absolute, unwavering nerve. You had to fly your aircraft directly at an enemy fighter and trust your calculations, trust your positioning, trust that you'd lined up the geometry correctly. Most pilots couldn't do it. The natural instinct when flying toward another aircraft at 600 miles per hour was to break away, to avoid collision. Prop fighting required suppressing that instinct, holding course, maintaining position until the last possible moment. Between March and August of 1944, Callahan used prop fighting 3 more times, once against another Zero, twice against Key 43 Oscars. All 3 engagements resulted in confirmed kills. His guns never failed again after that first incident. The hydraulic oil pump had been replaced 2 days after the mission to Rabaul, but he kept the technique ready, a last resort option. Other pilots in the 348th Fighter Group tried prop fighting. 2 succeeded. 1 died. Lieutenant Robert Hammond attempted a propeller attack on August 17, 1944, over Wewak. His propeller struck a Zero's fuselage instead of the wing or tail. The impact destroyed his engine mount. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 tore loose from its mounts and fell away. Hammond's P-47 went into an immediate dive. He didn't have time to bail out. The aircraft hit the jungle at over 400 miles per hour. Recovery teams never found his body. Hammond's death reinforced what everyone already knew. Prop fighting was effective but deadly. It required perfect timing, perfect positioning, and perfect nerve. One mistake, and you died. The Japanese never developed effective countermeasures. Their intelligence analysts couldn't believe American pilots were deliberately using propellers as weapons. The reports seemed impossible. Exaggerated accounts from panicked pilots who'd just watched their wingmen die, but the evidence was undeniable. Zero fighters with severed wings, tails cut cleanly off, fabric and metal fragments wrapped around American propeller blades. The Americans weren't just shooting anymore. They were cutting. By September 1944, Japanese fighter pilots in the South Pacific had standing orders. If an American P-47 approached for what appeared to be a propeller attack, break away immediately. Don't try to outturn them. Don't try to outclimb them. Just break contact and escape. The order came too late to save many pilots. Between March and October 1944, 12 Japanese aircraft were destroyed through propeller attacks by American fighters in the Pacific Theater. 9 of those were credited to P-47 pilots. 3 to P-38 pilots who'd adapted the technique. Callahan survived the war. 72 combat missions, 11 confirmed kills, 2 with his propeller, 9 with his guns after they were repaired. He returned to Tulsa in December 1945, took over his father's hardware store when his father retired in 1947. He never flew again, never wanted to. The memory of that metallic scream when his propeller hit the Zero's wing stayed with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes he'd wake up at night hearing it. The sound of aluminum blades cutting through aircraft structure at supersonic speeds. His wife asked him once what that sound was like. He told her it was the sound of desperation, the sound of a man with no other options finding a solution anyway, the sound of survival at any cost. The P-47 Thunderbolt Blind Fury that Callahan flew on March 8, 1944, no longer exists. The aircraft was damaged beyond repair in a landing accident in September 1944. A different pilot, a different mission. The propeller from that day, the one with bent blades and embedded metal fragments, was removed and sent back to the United States for analysis. That propeller is now preserved at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. It sits in a climate-controlled display case. A small brass plaque tells the story. March 8, 1944. The day an American pilot's guns failed and he refused to accept defeat. The day innovation happened not through official channels or engineering committees, but through one man facing impossible odds and finding another way. Hamilton Standard Propellers, the company that manufactured the P-47's propeller, never officially acknowledged that their product could be used as a weapon. They couldn't. Acknowledging it would create liability issues, insurance problems, legal complications. But internal company memos from 1944 reveal that Hamilton Standard engineers knew. They'd examined damaged propellers returned from the Pacific. They'd analyzed the stress patterns. They'd calculated the forces involved. They knew their propellers were being used in ways never intended by the designers. The engineers recommended no changes to the propeller design. The blades were already as strong as they could be made while maintaining acceptable weight. Making them stronger would make them heavier. Heavier propellers would reduce aircraft performance. Reduced performance would cost lives. The engineers also noted something else. The propeller attacks that succeeded were always against lightweight enemy aircraft. Japanese Zeros, Oscars, aircraft built from aluminum alloy and fabric. The technique wouldn't work against heavier aircraft. German fighters with their robust construction and armor plating would destroy a P-47's propeller without suffering significant damage. This was never tested in combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt primarily fought in the Pacific Theater against Japanese aircraft. When P-47s deployed to Europe, they fought using conventional gun tactics. No propeller attacks were ever recorded against German aircraft. The technique remained a Pacific phenomenon. A desperate innovation born from one pilot's gun failure and his refusal to abandon the bombers he was escorting. That's the real story of innovation in war. Not the official programs, not the planned developments, not the research projects with million-dollar budgets. The moments when one person faces an impossible situation and refuses to accept the obvious answer. When equipment fails but determination doesn't. When survival depends on thinking differently. Callahan's solution was brutal, dangerous, unconventional, but it worked. He saved 16 bombers, he killed 2 enemy fighters, he came home alive. He taught others a technique that would save more lives before the war ended. Sometimes that's all that matters. Not elegance, not following procedures, just results. If this story reminded you why we preserve these forgotten histories, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Real stories, real pilots, real innovation born from desperation. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We're sharing stories like this every day. Stories that deserve to be remembered. Stories about people who refused to quit when everything went wrong. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Japan. Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. Tell us if you've heard other stories about unconventional combat tactics. Just let us know you're here. Let us know these stories matter to you. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure James Callahan's story doesn't disappear into history. This hardware store kid from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who turned a catastrophic equipment failure into a deadly weapon, who saved 16 bombers and their crews, who came home and never talked about what he'd done because the memories were too painful. His propeller sits in a museum in Texas. His story lives here, with you, because you chose to watch, because you chose to remember, because you understand that real heroes don't always follow the manual. Sometimes they write their own.